So there's a few terms I want to make sure everyone gets clear. There's segregation, there's desegregation, and there's integration. Segregation is a system in which African American students and white students were legally prohibited from being at the school. Desegregation is an effort um, to make sure that those legal vestiges are removed, and so that African American students and white children could attend the same schools. That's very different from what we're going to see in this case we're going to cover right here, where the court moves to a solution or types of solutions. Remember that desegregation was, okay, you have to desegregate with all deliberate speed, but you have to desegregate, which means you have to make sure that every school can admit African American students and white students. You can't have a white school and a black school. That is the definition of segregation. But the method by which they went about it, localities, was entirely up to them. Now, there are two reasons why the court kind of moves to this integration-based approach away from the desegregation-based approach. And the reason for that is, the first reason for that is clearly, as you saw in the last case, numerous school districts, state legislatures, what have you, all sorts of entities, were putting up impediments towards desegregation efforts. Whether it is, deleting public schools, or any other number, into instituting school choice programs in which the administration got to choose what school someone went to, and those school choice programs were always rigged against African American students. Laws that prohibited it at the state level. So all of these things sort of served as an impediment to desegregation efforts. Second, there are a lot of vestiges within society that desegregation wouldn't solve. One of those most notably being is, especially during the 1960s, though you still see it today, and I'll give you an example here shortly, is that individuals tend to live with like individuals, which is to say that if I were to ask you a very simple question, you would know the answer. So, where do you think I live in El Paso? Where in El Paso do you think my house is where I'm sitting right now? East side. Yeah, there we go. West, west, west. Okay, yeah. There we go. Yeah, everyone knows I live on the west side. Now, why do you presume I live on the west side? And yes, I do live on the west side, so you're right. Why do I live on the west side of town? What would make you assume that? Close to work. I'm like still 20 minutes away from work. I'm basically New Mexico. Professor equals money. Yep, that's one reason. What other factors? Because even if I wasn't professor, I'm willing to bet you all would still assume I lived on the west side. You're an educated white guy. Yeah, that's pretty much it. That right there. Um, that's the truth of it. So, what can you say about schools like Coronado um, that are different from schools on the east side? More white students go to those schools. Yeah, and there's money because things are based on property taxes. Yeah, Coronado has more white rich families. Exactly. So if we now, there's no doubt that Coronado is integrated, meaning that there are still Hispanic students, a large number. In fact, I would still say the majority of students at Coronado are Hispanic, but there's a sizable population that's white. Where I'm certain that you could look at a number of schools on the east side, and the portion of white students, or at least Caucasian students, would be much lower. And the reason for that is not many white families live in those areas where the east side school districts are. Um, and so it's very easy to identify what schools are predominantly, overwhelmingly Hispanic in this area, in this city, and schools which are more blended. Um, this effect is even magnified when you get to larger cities. Um, Chicago, for example, is a perfect example. If you live in certain areas of South Side Chicago, the schools are almost 90% African American. And if you live in North Side Chicago, some of the schools are almost 90% white. Now, that logistically has nothing to do with the failure of those schools to tear down the vestiges of segregation. There are no impediments that exist in those school systems which prevent African American students from going to a white school or white students from going to a predominantly African American school. But what it does reflect is differences in where we live. And so if the goal of the Supreme Court is to desegregate, that barrier has been met. But if the goal of the Supreme Court is to integrate the schools, it hasn't. And so integration is the taking of steps to make sure that school districts and schools in particular have some parity with degree to the ethnicity of students that attend there. That's the difference. Desegregation is law nationwide, but we still see and can easily recognize schools that are predominantly one ethnic group or another, and that's because of patterns of where people live. Now, when the Supreme Court moves to the integration portion of how they deal with this issue, integration attempts to solve that and other issues. So that's really the difference between segregation, desegregation, integration. I really want you to get those concepts in your head because they are different. And when the court moves to integration, you're going to notice that it acts differently. Because the court really hasn't told anyone how to desegregate. They're like, hey, you have to desegregate. It's up to you, local school districts and states, and you have to do it with all deliberate speed. But they provide them no help or guidelines or anything to do so. When it comes to the integration cases, they don't shy away from, hey, you need to do this and try this, and here's another possible way to do it. And then in some cases, just outright commanding school districts, you must do these things. So they prescribe a very particular answer or very particular answers to policy problems. And that policy problem is to focus on the integration of these school districts. It's not just enough to tear away desegregation for the court during this period. They want to make sure that school districts are integrated, not just desegregated. Does that make sense? Perfect. Does everyone get the differentiations of those concepts now? All right. Well, then let's take on the first desegregation case, or even I will mess up, the first integration case that the court weighs in on. So Green versus County School Board is the first case in which the Supreme Court takes a very, very activist bent. In fact, the vestiges that we hear when conservative politicians look at court systems and call them activist. Um, this court right now is what they're talking about. It's a holdover from the late 60s and early 70s, where you had a liberal majority court who was very activist. But I again want to point out, as I did in the beginning of this class way back in January, is that activism is a term which has a clear definition and also has a popular usage. And at this point, when we say activist court, or when someone says activist court, what they mean is that is a liberal court. But it's subtracted from the fact that in the 1920s and 30s, there was a very, very activist court who was simultaneously very conservative. The nature of being activist, of a court being activist, is not dependent upon the ideology of the court. In fact, looking at the current Supreme Court we have now with its membership, it remains to be seen if it is going to be activist. But if it does, it will be a conservative activist court, just simply because of its majority. And it very well has that in its ability. We have yet to see if it will play out that way. But I think in some certain areas, if the current court isn't activist, individuals who fought for certain members to sit on that court would be very upset with them, because the reason why you put particularized individuals on a court is for policy change reasons. So if jurisprudence doesn't change on things like affirmative action, abortion, immigration, there would be a sizable portion of the conservative voter bloc who would be upset with the individuals who had been put on the court. So we may see the court react in an activist fashion, at least in the short term. But we'll see. But in this case, very clearly, the Supreme Court is very liberal, perhaps some of the most liberal it has been in its existence. And it's also simultaneously very activist. And in this case, it is very activist. So once again, this case takes place in Virginia. And Virginia is a common return to by the court in the area of desegregation and integration. So what exists is there exists racial segregation is mandated in the Virginia Constitution, and various laws were passed without the state and local level to ensure that no desegregation would occur. One of these, the state passed a quote, freedom of choice law, which permitted students to choose which school, the black school or the white school they wish to attend. The petitioners in this case argued that this choice program continued to reinforce the existing system, which was largely racially divided, since not one white student chose to go to the black school. Numerous black students wanted to go to the white school, but not a single white student wanted to go to the black school. And so the school board was saying, well, this is individuals deciding, and there are no legal barriers. So we have, in essence, desegregated the school systems, but the people acting are simply choosing not to go to the African-American school. So we've desegregated. There are no legal barriers to segregation. So we've complied with the orders of Brown 1 and Brown 2. And so simply the only really issue in this case is, has the decisions of the school board gone to comply with Brown 1 and Brown 2? And the Supreme Court says, legally, you have complied, but you have not complied with the spirit of what we intended in Brown 1 and Brown 2. They say that the burden on a school board today is to come forward with a plan that promises realistic to work and promises realistically to work now. We do not hold that freedom of choice can have no place in such plans. We do not hold that freedom of choice plan might in and of itself be unconstitutional, although that argument isn't urged upon us today. Rather, what we decide today is that in desegregating a dual system, a plan utilizing freedom of choice is not an end unto itself. So they have moved away from you have to desegregate, which is removing legal barriers, to there is an end that they see that they want, a policy end. And therefore, they're going to push for that end. What that means is desegregation, removing the legal barriers, is not enough. They argue that the Supreme Court, or they argue that they have to, integration has to be the result at once, so that the schools themselves have to be integrated. You have to have schools which include African American students and white students. And if freedom of choice plan is involved in that, it's not inherently unconstitutional to have a freedom of choice plan. But if the end is the schools are still de facto segregated, then that freedom of choice plan does not comply with Brown 1 and Brown 2. That you have to institute a plan that makes sure these school districts integrate. Desegregation is not enough. Removing legal vestiges is not enough. If you truly want to solve the issues that we clearly identified in Brown 1, that there are psychological effects upon students, both white and African American, to going to segregated school systems, that finding still holds. And even though you've removed the legal barriers that are technically preventing African American students from attending the same schools as white students, a freedom of choice plan has maintained that segregated system de facto. And so you have to solve de facto segregation in this case. Removing the laws is not enough. You have to come up with a plan that integrates. And so this decision sort of hints at the court has moved away from this idea that desegregation is a solution to this problem. They're moving very close towards the goal, the policy end that they want is an integrated school system. And while in this case, in Green, they don't prescribe any fashion by which you must reach an integrated school system, they very much hint at the idea that they're willing to go there. And they're willing to provide mechanisms that will guarantee that school systems are integrated.